John Harner is the professor. He is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. He received his PhD from the Arizona State University in 1996. His research interests focus on American urban landscapes, cultural, economic, and social connections between the United States and Mexico, and the historical geography of Colorado Springs, which we're going to explore today. His local work has culminated in the book, Profiting from the Peak, Landscape and Liberty in Colorado Springs. That book is now for sale in this museum, the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum's gift shop. So come and pick up a copy. Research for this book contributed to The Story of Us, which was a digital humanities exhibit that we have here at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And of course, the most recent exhibit, the COS at 150, he also contributed artifact textural descriptions based off of his work. In 2018, he received the CU Thomas Jefferson Award. So excited to welcome John. John, if you want to go ahead and hop on, we will go ahead and get started with today's program. Thanks for being here.
Great. I hope you can hear me. I think things are working.
Yes, everything looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you, Meg, for that introduction and for all the work you do for the city and the museum. As Meg said, I have been collaborating and working in the museum for over a decade now. And it's been great working on many projects with all the great people at the Pioneers Museum. In fact, this is my third of these Scholar Series talks as well, so they've been fun also. I will say the product of all this work has been this book that Meg mentioned that just came out last month, Profiting from the Peak, Landscape and Liberty in Colorado Springs, which is perfect for our sesquicentennial because it's really the story of Colorado Springs. And by way of introduction to this talk and also what this book is about, I just want to clarify two items. First, I call this book a historical geography because I am not a historian, I'm a geographer. And people often ask, what does that mean? What's a historical geography? What's the difference between that and history? And we needn't go into a long discussion about the academic differences between geography and history, but the obvious answer, the initial answer is, I focus a lot on, as a geographer, on the spatial dimension. So I use a lot of maps, and I'm interested in the shape of the city and the way it's connected and how it was all built, and particularly on the landscape, the built environment, the way it looks, right? So that's where I'm coming from. Just anecdotally, I'll mention, I've worked a lot with Leah Davis Witherell, many of you know, or fantastic curator of history at the museum. And we work collaboratively on many projects. She's a historian and I'm a geographer. And I just noted on one recent project we worked on in June, we had it was Bike Month. So we put together with Kate Brady, the city bike planner, a bunch of routes, bike riding routes throughout the city with historical, interpretive points along the routes. And as we were coming up with these, I would always focus on like the infrastructure, like, oh, there used to be a bridge here, or the railroad went over this place, or, oh, there's this old African-American church in this neighborhood. And Leah tended to always focus on the people, right? Oh, this is where Leon Young did his work. And, these are the people who lived in the Conejos neighborhood. So that's just one difference, the way we approach, the stories of Colorado Springs. She really focuses a lot on the characters and people who make this place. And I tend to focus more on the landscape, the built environment, the way it looks. But I'll say that both of us end up telling stories that shape Colorado Springs. And a city captures its cultural heritage through this storytelling. And that's exactly what the museum is about. So I think this geographic perspective brings a good interdisciplinary context, which enriches the story of Colorado Springs. So that's one item I just wanted to clarify when I call it historical geography. The second item is the topic, the title of this talk, I called it Sense of Place in Colorado Springs. And this is not a phrase I typically use, sense of place. When I was back in graduate school decades ago studying this stuff, we would talk about place identity, right? The characteristics that define and give meaning to a place. But I wanted to use sense of place because I think it's more commonly used by most of you out there. You know, many people have heard and think about sense of place. But one reason I was reluctant to use it is there's a little bit of confusion with that phrase as well. Particularly, we have to wonder, is the sense of place an attribute of a person? In other words, do people have a sense of place? Or is it a characteristic of the place? Like, does a city have a sense of place? Is it a human part or is it a place part? And this is, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And my answer is that it's really impossible to disentangle these two, right? Because the built environment affects our personal identity, right? Every day we traverse through the landscapes that we create and we're bombarded with imagery and symbolism that reflects our values. The built landscape, it reflects our values and our ideas, how we think the world should work, where we put our focus and our emphasis and our resources. And then we internalize that and it becomes part of who we are. So in fact, the sense of place is this interplay between people and place. And culture, you know, which is something humans create, is embedded in our landscapes, and that helps formulate our value systems. So in many ways, then, sense of place probably is the correct phrase to use. There have been a lot of people, geographers particularly, who've written about this, who say things like, you know, places are created and known through our common experience and involvement in symbols and meanings. And in short, people are its place and a place is its people. I'll just add one more seminal scholar, a man named J.B. Jackson, who studied the cultural landscape, really emphasized the sense of time when he's talking about a sense of place. He said, through repeated routine, we build our sense of place. And as our sense of time, or the sense of ritual, which in the long run creates our sense of place. So I wanted to add that because it shows how history and geography come together. If we want to understand a place, which is what this book is about, Colorado Springs, you have to talk about the history, you know, the events that shape that, but you also have to talk about the geography, the result of those events, so why the city looks the way it does. So that's just some introductions to what I hope it helps you understand what I'm trying to get at here. And that ends the academic part of this talk. Thanks for bearing with me. I won't go any more into the stuff I teach in my class, but I think you've all earned 3 credits of geography from UCCS now. So talk to our chancellor and tell him I told you you get 3 credits, see how far that gets you. But I'll move on to what's probably people are most interested in, since people, most of you are local history buffs and appreciate, you know, what's in the content of this book, what's it about. And here are the 10 chapters of the book. The first one is really an introduction, and the last one is a summary. But in between are 8 thematic chapters, you know, some of the big things that went into shaping our city. So that's how I approach this. And the problem is, right off the bat, there's too much material. I can't go through it all in this talk. In fact, every one of these chapters could be a separate book. And, you know, many people, I had a few very helpful people who read my manuscript before it was published, and they kept telling me, oh, you got to add this, you got to add that. The reality is, when I sent my manuscript into the publisher, I had to cut over 30,000 words out, which is like 2 entire chapters. So I already have too much information, and it's longer than they wanted it to be. So it's very hard to try and distill, you know, 150 years of the story of Colorado Springs into a readable book that's not going to overwhelm people. So I really tried to keep a balance between not too much detail, but just enough to keep it interesting. So I will, in this talk, just kind of breeze through these chapters real quickly. Is all I can say is, if you want to know more, you're interested in one of these particular topics, please read the book, right? You can purchase it or you can get it from the library and you might find it interesting. So let me just go through, and what I want to really focus on is some of the summary, the conclusions at the end, but I will go through just briefly the content of each of these chapters. We know, first of all, that the beginning chapter is about the settlement of Colorado Springs, and this was a short grass prairie, an arid environment. There were no trees here, but it was specifically picked by General William Jackson Palmer as the place where the plains met the mountains. You know, the spectacular backdrop of Pikes Peak and Manitou Springs and Garden of the Gods and all of that was where he wanted to build his city, from which he would sell lots. It was a business venture, and also be a home for his railroad. He was building a railroad, the Denver and Rio Grande, and he envisioned a little kind of resort community for people to live amongst the Rocky Mountains. Right away, though, they recognized, the initial investors and city founders, we needed water, right? So the first big thematic chapter is all about the water history of Colorado Springs. And I hope you can see that. I don't know how much things are being blocked here on the screen. But this map is the El Paso Canal, our first waterworks, which brought irrigation water to the city. So starting over here on about 31st Street, where there's still a diversion dam, it wound its way through the west side. It crossed Monument Creek up near the neighborhood of Roswell, came across what's the north side of the original downtown, and there were ditches running down most of the main streets with laterals that brought water. It terminated in the, originally Boulder Park was a reservoir, but then into Evergreen Cemetery, and Prospect Lake also got its water from this canal. So the city founders knew right away we needed water, but this was not drinking water. This was just to irrigate the land, to plant trees, do your laundry, for livestock, that type of thing. Our first drinking water project started from Manitou Springs, went up Ruxton Creek. We enlarged some natural lakes. And the important thing here is that if you see this dashed black line, we crossed over into an entirely different watershed. So all of these rivers from these reservoirs on the south slope of Pikes Peak flow south down towards Penrose and to the Arkansas River. They were not even flowing into Colorado Springs, but we built first a ditch and then a pipeline and later a tunnel to cross this divide and bring water from a different watershed into our city. So with that, those initial projects in the late 1800s, Colorado Springs became a big player in the whole state's development of our water law, the doctrine of prior appropriation, where you get water rights, first come, first served, and the first in line gets the first access. And it developed water law in the entire West. So we were a big player of that. So I tell that story quite a bit. And then there were 7 big projects after this, well, including this, 6 others, where we increasingly went farther away, 5 of them across the Continental Divide, to bring water to our city. So if you're interested in that, that's a big chapter, the first chapter, because we wouldn't be Colorado Springs without all of the investment we've put in it. And the result, of course, is this was up from Palmer Park, what the city looked like originally with no trees. It was described by people as being very unattractive, relentlessly dry, to this dense urban canopy that we have today. So it's a big part of the story of Colorado Springs. The next chapter also deals with an aspect of our climate, our dry air and our sunny days. And our first growth industry, many of you are aware, was as a cure for tuberculosis, because there was no known cure. And the best remedy was to come to the high Rocky Mountains and sit out and soak up the sun and breathe the dry air. And we developed a whole industry of sanatoriums. This is the Modern Woodman, one of the many sanatoriums that were here. This sort of evolved out of the health spa tradition in Switzerland and Germany. We brought it here and created these sanatoriums where people would come and hopefully improve their health. One of our main architectural contributions were these gardener huts, these little huts that were built to facilitate a flow of air at all times, so people would have increased their respiration. And you can see that we had these green dots are the early sanatoria, but the red crosses are later ones. There's some down lower here on the screen. There was a spatial logic. We wanted these people coming here and spending their money and investing in the community, but we didn't want them too close to the downtown with carrying these communicable diseases. So these sanatoria kind of ringed the periphery of the city. And many are still around today in new forms, like UCCS was a sanatorium. Both Penrose and Memorial Hospital were originally sanatoriums, and there are several others that are still here in different forms, Union Printers Home, etc. So that was one of our big growth industries that really shaped the city in the early days until we eventually eradicated tuberculosis with antibiotics. So after this, and even during this, one of the big shapers of the city and the entire West was railroads, right? And General Palmer himself was a railroad man. He built Denver and Rio Grande. So I have a whole chapter about this. Here in about 1915, at the height of the railroad era, we were served by 7 different rail lines, if you include the Cog Railway, which is really just a tourist train, but I include it anyway. We had a direct route on the Rock Island to Chicago. The Santa Fe and the Denver and Rio Grande were competing lines running north-south through the city, which connected us to Pueblo and Denver and brought lots of people and goods. We had other connecting lines in the Midland, went over to Aspen, to the mines in Aspen, and we had 2 lines going up to Cripple Creek. So this was a fundamental part. This is connected Colorado Springs to the rest of the world. And it also drove Colorado Springs' influence in the city, in the state, because the Denver and Rio Grande connected to all the mining towns, and it was originally headquartered here. And in fact, General Palmer also was the original founder and president of what would become the big steel works down in Pueblo, and they built steel rails for the railroads there. So a lot of influence Colorado Springs had on the rest of the state and the region because of the railroads. We still see lasting remnants of this. This is the roundhouse over on the west side on 21st Street, and this is where the Midland Railroad, worked on their trains. There were 4 others of these in the city, big rail yards, employed a lot of people. So this is a big part of our story as well. But nothing shaped the landscape of Colorado Springs more than the gold boom at Cripple Creek. This is the mining exchange, which originally, the hotel now, but originally was a big stockbroker, the largest mining stock exchange building outside of the New York City. And all of the gold mining took place in Cripple Creek, which is the richest gold mining site in the country, and even rivals those of the world. All of the capital was controlled here in Colorado Springs. The mine owners, the investors were here initially. Eventually, they became multinational firms. But in the boom days, it was run by Colorado Springs investors, and that brought a lot of wealth into our city and really shaped the landscape through things like this building and many others in the downtown. So it profoundly changed the place. In addition to the many millionaires which got rich off of Cripple Creek and built things in Colorado Springs, it really injected an industrial presence into our city. So here on the west side, in these little red circles, there's 2 gold processing mills here, another here, and another here. So we bring the ore down from Cripple Creek and process it here, where we had access to water and coal for energy, and this really changed the image and the presence in Colorado Springs from just a resort community to an industrial base. A lot of smoke coming off of these things. The tailings piles, Gold Hill Mesa, where they're building the houses now, was all these tailing piles from the Golden Cycle Mill, the leftover rock after the processing was done. So it brought an industrial presence, and it also brought a lot of immigrant labor, people working both in the mines in Cripple Creek, but working in the rail yards and in these gold processing mills. So the west side, Colorado City, which was independent until 1917 when we annexed it. But this was the real blue collar area with a lot of workers, a lot of immigrant labor, and it changed the dynamics of the city, right? And the whole Colorado Springs developed into kind of the pro-business, capitalist class, pro-Republican politics, and the west side was more the workers. And there were some pretty violent labor wars in Cripple Creek and here in Colorado Springs, which just strengthened this sort of pro-business ethic of the political culture of Colorado Springs. So it was a profound shaper of our political culture and our environment, even to this day. So the Cripple Creek story, I don't write the history of Cripple Creek, that's been done many times, but I write about the connections between Cripple Creek and Colorado Springs and how that gold boom affected this place, how it affected Colorado Springs. That's really my interest, right? So in the same chapter though, I call it rock because it's about mining. I couldn't ignore the coal mining, which also took place in Colorado Springs. And here's the downtown, and we had a string of coal mines going from the Pikeview mine over by Pope's Bluff, just west of the interstate, all the way out past the airport. The Cragmore neighborhood, which I've zoomed into here, was the most densely mined region, right below UCCS. If you know Portal Park, it's right here, right? Papeton was a little mining community. All of these mines served by rail connections to get the coal out, which was used in the smelters and the mills for energy, and also just for people in the city to burn to heat their house. And it was also used to generate electricity. These areas, we don't know much about this anymore because it's sort of erased from the landscape. But there were big subsidence zones, which throughout, especially in the 1960s, there were lots of sinkholes and houses falling down and cracks appearing. So people were aware of it. Right when this Cragmore neighborhood was being built up as a residential area was when all the subsidence was happening. And it hasn't entirely disappeared. There was a sinkhole that showed up just a few years ago right on a street here below UCCS. So it's another part of our history. And it was a great employment source for us, particularly African Americans, but other laborers, who had no other jobs. So I wanted to include that in the mining chapter, not just Cripple Creek. One thing though, that all of those chapters so far were kind of boom and bust periods, right? We had a bunch of waterworks, we had tuberculosis, then it went away. We had the boom and bust of gold mining, and coal disappeared as we replaced it with natural gas. But one thing that has lasted throughout the beginning of the city to this day is our tourism and recreation economy. And, the city, Palmer's vision was really for kind of a sort of resort getaway, for people to come and enjoy the Rocky Mountains. And it was really focused on Manitou Springs around the mineral baths. We had streetcars running over there and a lot of hotels built all around Manitou Springs. And people would come here as their entree into, this beautiful landscape, which you didn't see in the East. This got Colorado Springs, to recognize, hey, we can't let Manitou get all the business. We have to have some, posh hotels, and we built the Antlers Hotel. This is the second version, not the first, with this embellished Pikes Peak behind it. It's not quite that large or that close, but it looks great. And of course, also the Broadmoor was built by Spencer Penrose with money. He got wealthy off of Cripple Creek, and that's, our other big resort hotel. So it really just accelerated this whole era of tourism and people coming here for vacation and to get away and to, go to the mineral baths and to experience the Rocky Mountains. And I argue in the book that this had led directly to our contemporary recreation economy. I mean, think today, this weekend, there's the Pikes Peak Marathon, right? And people come here still for these recreation and sporting opportunities, fly fishing, mountain bike riding, climbing the incline. All of these things are a result of our early focus on this experiencing the active lifestyle, experiencing the outdoors. And I also argue that that directly led into our branding as the Olympic City, USA, because we went out and attracted the Olympic headquarters and the training center. And we argued, look, this is a great place for athletes to train at 6,000 feet elevation and the mountains. And all of this is tied together, at least in my mind. You know, it's always my interpretation. But, I'm trying to use data to inform upon that. But our contemporary branding of Olympic City, USA is part of this active lifestyle that's always been with us from the very beginning. So it's this whole chapter, I call it fun, is about tourism and play and how this all evolved in Colorado Springs. And let me just read a pause here, and I'll read a brief passage from the book. It's from this chapter, because I really think it shows an important way that General Palmer was very visionary about what he tried to build here. So I'll just read this briefly. Colorado Springs, from its very founding, charted a path different from most Western cities, banking on recreational pleasure seekers and the beauty of its environment. It has successfully marketed its landscape to create a place identity before this became a standard strategy among the many Western amenity-based towns of today. From today's perspective, this may seem natural or obvious, but considering that the main economic driver of the late 19th century was agriculture, with commerce, industry, and mining close behind, then to gamble on the success of a real estate venture based on tourism and relaxation was risky. During the same era that Colorado Springs was starting this new experiment, the competing Union Colony, which is now the town of Greeley, was founded to the north based on a communal commitment to irrigated agriculture. Asked to compare the likelihood for success between the two, Nathan Meeker of the Union Colony said, "The people of Greeley are engaged in creating wealth, those of Colorado Springs in spending it, and we all know which fountain is the deepest." So to this criticism, General Palmer responded, "This attractiveness to the locality then has been the dominant fact, and it is not unlikely that men may always continue to succumb to its subtle and indescribable beauty. If so, our fountain may be deeper than Meeker was willing to admit. Men may even be willing to sacrifice the chance of producing more wealth for the sake of enjoying better what they already have. Here is a resource less exhaustible perhaps than a garden soil, large streams for irrigating water, iron and coal mines, and the other useful elements of industrial growth." So I just think that illustrates that General Palmer was really ahead of his time in envisioning this development of a recreation-based economy, which was not normal back when the city was founded, right? And he was criticized that it would never succeed, but here we are, very successful place. So the next chapter is all about our relationship with the military. Of course, a huge player in Colorado Springs, although for the first 70 years, the first half of our existence, we had no relationship with the military. Then for the second 80 years, the second half, it's become the dominant economic force in the region, as well as a major land user. You look at this map. So I write about, Fort Carson, the Army post, which was our first initiative bringing in military facilities here, and it fundamentally changed the city. It basically doubled the size of the city in a few short months during World War II. But the real player in the city became the Air Force. And here's our old Air Force Base, which was originally the Bethel Tuberculosis Sanatorium and later Memorial Hospital. Then it became the Air Force Base. This is an aerial view of it, and now it's the Olympic Training Center, right? Olympic and Paralympic Training Center. So that's a fun story to relate. And as well, I talk a lot about the Air Force Academy, how we actively went out and got it, and I a lot also about the spectacular example of modernist architecture, which the Air Force Academy represents, one of the best examples of modernist architecture in the world, right? So it's a big part of who we are in Colorado Springs, all of the military installations, the academy included. So that's a whole chapter that, and it fits right in with other chapters, about the next one, particularly about liberty. So that's another big story. The chapter after that I do call liberty, and this is a long chapter, and I really wanted to get at our political culture, right? To many people, Colorado Springs is known as conservative city, right? And I want to say, well, where'd that come from, and what does that mean, right? But before I even do that, I wanted to point out that liberty means different things to different people. So I have a little section here on the African-American experience in Colorado Springs. And this map, which is actually hanging in the exhibit in the Pioneers Museum, from data that Leah and her interns gathered long ago, is a great representation of the neighborhoods, the early African-American neighborhoods around the downtown, particularly around the railroad tracks and the industrial sites. But they were fleeing, persecution and violence in the Jim Crow South, and found a home here, and we're a rich part of our story. Liberty also means freedom, mobility freedom. And as the city started to grow, not real big, but getting a little bigger, we had a very robust streetcar system, these trolley lines I show here in 1920. And I also show with these yellow dots, these were all corner grocery stores. There were over 130 corner grocery stores throughout the city. So we had a little town, a little city, well served by public transportation, with mixed use and walkable neighborhoods, small bungalow homes, about 800 to 1,000 square foot, the type of neighborhood that many urban planners are trying to reproduce today. So it was a different place back then, but very successful. So these, to me, all fit into this notion of liberty. But what liberty really means, and what I talk about most, is a freedom from regulation, a deregulated environment, small government ethic, right? As Mayor Suthers says today, I'm a small government guy. So what that translates into is this, a sort of libertarian, this Rocky Mountain ethic that we're a bigger part of the bigger Rocky Mountain West. Leave me alone. We don't need government mandates. Let business function. Let's look to the private sector to answer many of our, societal problems. And that's great. It's just the political culture of Colorado Springs. One thing that it directly translates into, though, in a deregulated development environment, is urban sprawl. So if we look from 1950, the footprint of the city, to 2010, it just mushroomed, right? And most of Colorado Springs now is like a suburban environment outside of the old historic core. I talk a lot about that relationship between urban sprawl and the political culture that it fosters and that led to it. So if you like the chapter. One final chapter I could not neglect is the influence of the Christian right and the evangelical community on Colorado Springs, particularly in the 1990s and the early 2000s, because we were a national player, right? We were known throughout the country as like the evangelical Mecca, the homeland. And there was influence directly into the White House. All Republican presidential candidates came to Colorado Springs to seek the blessing of some of our big leaders. So I talk about that whole story and the evolution of new expressions of Christianity in Colorado Springs. So that really is a brief run through of the content, right? And in my final chapter, I try to summarize it up, which I'd like to just spend some time on now and say, after all of these chapters and all of these stories, what is it that gives Colorado Springs a sense of place? So from the many events that shape this story, capital accumulation has been a defining theme from the very beginning. And wealth generation was long sustained by exploiting our environmental capital and generating profits from the beauty of our environment. So we've been profiting from the peak, hence the title of my book. And we've built an urban infrastructure to sustain that relationship. So from that, I really say, well, I have three things that I say create the sense of place of Colorado Springs and will continue to create a place identity. And one is the built environment, which I translate into the historic downtown. Two is the political culture, which is this focus on liberty and limited governance. And three, of course, is the physical landmarks, the Pikes Peak itself. So let me just say a few things about each of these, because this is like the concluding chapter. Much research shows that historical landmarks are among the most powerful shapers of urban identity. So buildings like the Pioneers Museum itself, the old county courthouse, really create a sense of place, right? People seek some sort of authenticity or connection to the past, between the past and the contemporary environment. And people want to feel a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to be relevant. And these public spaces downtown are where public events take place, whether it's protest or celebrations or parades or music festivals or food or that type of thing. The downtown is the place for that to happen. And when people socially engage with others, they're happy, right? Whether it's good for business, from unintentionally bumping into people that may lead to business ties, or just social engagement. And cities are created to bring people together. That's really what they're for. So the historic architecture in the downtown, the Arts on the Street program, the public spaces, the museums, the street festivals, the summer flower planters and the winter holiday decorations, they all enliven the ambiance and enable public interaction. So Tejon Street, in fact, just won an award for a great downtown street. So cities should seek to reveal the experience of their origins by preserving historic buildings and districts and branding distinctive neighborhood identities, right? The downtown is the place that projects the image of the city to the rest of the world. And it needn't only be historic. New institutions like the brand new Olympic Museum is also going to be something that stamps the identity of Colorado Springs into people's minds all around the country and the world. So I argue that Colorado Springs needs to continually strengthen its historic core and avoid becoming just a generic placeless landscape, right? So I support the Downtown Partnership and their initiatives to try and strengthen our downtown. The second conclusion is this our political culture, right? It's part of what Colorado Springs is. It's what we're known for. And one conceptualization of that is the support for the military, right? The armed forces have always seen as defenders of freedom, and that fits in well with the image of the city as a place of freedom and liberty. So here's an old photo I found of an Army missile on the grounds of the Pioneers Museum. I don't know if that would happen today, but it symbolizes the relationship between the military and Colorado Springs. But the real version of freedom that evolved in Colorado Springs largely means freedom from regulation that might restrict profit making, right? And Palmer's land development projects from the very beginning, the railroads and his land development went hand in hand, and they fed each other. And it was a venture capitalism happening in a profit making enterprise from the very beginning. And things like Cripple Creek just strengthen that, right? As the investor class really got wealthy off of this gold boom, it accelerated these pro-business politics. So the industrial past generated a business culture that promotes free enterprise and sees opportunity in answers in the private sector. That's what Colorado Springs' political philosophy. Many residents also take great pleasure living in an environment relatively free from intrusive regulations. And the predominant philosophy of Colorado Springs is that everyone should be held accountable for their actions, and the freedom to make rational and informed choices is privileged over government-imposed mandates or restrictions on behavior, right? So to this day, this is what many people think of Colorado Springs when it comes to mind. And the city was a national leader in many of these initiatives, right? Libertarian-oriented initiatives. So this limited governance culture brings both challenges and benefits. So, I try to be honest, but this is a choice we make, every city makes, and every city has its pros and cons. So I just wanted to point those out. The prime benefit that we have is that low property taxes and unregulated development make for a much more affordable housing environment, right? Way more affordable than Denver or Boulder, that's for sure. And like I said, many people, take great pleasure in being in a deregulated environment. It also translates, though, into urban sprawl. So we have these relatively inefficient, we have affordable houses, but in an inefficient building design. And many of these, suburban landscapes do not create, I won't be too critical of them, but they're not creating places that like tourists would want to come because they look like suburban landscapes anywhere around the country. That's why I said that downtown historic core is really important. And we've also have this sort of designed obsolescence in many of these big box stores, like here on South Academy, which used to be a booming, shopping area for the city. And now it's kind of neglected and abandoned, and they're really difficult to deal with. A sea of parking and empty big box stores. What are we going to do with these landscapes now? And they don't create any sort of lasting place connections, right? Like people don't want to come here and hang out in that parking lot like they would downtown. So there are some drawbacks, is what I'm trying to point out. Also, the city faces continual fiscal constraints. So with low tax revenues, the consequences of that is lower public works, less public transit, fewer housing, subsidies and services for homeless people. So once again, it's a choice we make. So there's pros and cons. But that's a big part of who we are. And one day, we might have to address some of these, especially some of these externalities, like, with climate change, we don't have a regulated environment, but we aren't paying the consequences of our carbon emissions or our water consumption and all of these types of things. So these are issues that all cities face. So it's Colorado Springs has got to be realistic about it. Is this what we want to do? What do we think is the best path forward? And this is not a book about planning, by the way. It's not about the future, but there's implications you can clearly see. The final part of my conclusions is our relationship to Pikes, right? And the natural environment. Pikes Peak continues to shape our identity, right? It's the reason for the city's location, and the context-specific geography is important for our place identity. You can't think of Colorado Springs without thinking of Pikes Peak, right? The two are inseparable. So I would just like to leave with, I'll read another short passage from my conclusions about this relationship with Pikes Peak. And this will be, I'll be done after this. I'm happy to answer questions. So let me just read this last piece. The mountain is the source for much of its water, and this water shapes the urban forest canopy and sustains the ability to house nearly 700,000 people. Its snow cap is not only an inspiration to look at, but a reminder of the fragility of the environment. The sunny, dry, and cool climate attracts migrants today, just as it always has. The mountain shapes the weather, as each summer day starts with brilliant blue skies. Slowly, clouds build up from the rising air currents, then thunderstorms break free from the bonds of the slope and roll past the city on their way to Kansas. The recreation economy continues to drive events, generate jobs, and shape an urban identity. On Pikes Peak slopes, people ride bikes, ski, and hike, and in the streams and reservoirs they fish. They walk, drive, or take the Cog Railroad to the summit, and gold is still extracted from its western slopes. Spiritualists relish in nature to refresh themselves. Recreationists relax in the pines. Marketers promote its beauty and therapeutic effects, while military recruits and Olympic athletes train in the high altitude. Colorado Springs capitalizes on sports industries while adopting the Olympic City brand. America's mountain remains the very symbol of liberty, meshing perfectly with the city's identity. It is the Western frame of view that all residents look at each day, a point of reference and familiarity that signifies home. Pikes Peak is inseparable from Colorado Springs, and the city continues to profit from the peak. So I will leave you with that. If you are interested in this book at all, you can purchase it directly from the University Press of Colorado, and there's a website right there. It is also available, as Meg mentioned at the beginning, in the bookstore at the museum, which supports the museum at the same time, so you get a double benefit. You can just purchase it from Amazon also, or check it out from your library. Read it for free. If you're interested, I hope you like it. I'm always happy to, well, looking forward to hearing feedback, because I haven't heard any yet because it's so new. People haven't really read it. You know, I was hoping we would be in person. I'd even autograph your copies, but I'm happy to do that in the future if you ever want to meet with me some other time.